Hello and welcome back to the channel. I'm Dan, and this is Forlorn Hobbies. Hello and welcome back to the channel. Now, in today's video, I thought I would address the elephant in the room. And no, I'm not necessarily talking about the one that impregnated Blucher, but we will be turning our attention to the Prussians of the Napoleonic era. Now, why Prussians? Well, for regular viewers of the channel, you probably know that I had a interesting bet with Mr. Crew from Triumphant Hobbies in the run-up to Under Eagles to Glory as to whether I could paint my Russian army for it and he could paint his Spanish-Portuguese alliance. Now, obviously, I failed spectacularly, and as a consequence, I have to paint an entire brigade of Prussians. Now, in our regular hobby group for historicals, it's well known that Ian absolutely detests painting Prussians because he had to paint so many of them for the big Linny game that we had, which you can see the live streams on Napoleonic Wargaming's channel. And the weekend was a fantastic gaming experience. We all had fun. It was just like that ongoing kind of banter afterwards was always making Ian think about painting Prussians. But now it's my time to suffer. So in this video, I'm not going to be painting Prussians, but rather kind of looking into the kind of brief overview of Prussians during the Napoleonic era, maybe starting slightly beforehand, just to kind of have a not necessarily a deep dive, but just to kind of set the scene for actually why Prussians are quite interesting, as opposed to that kind of Anglo-centric view that it was just Wellington and the British that kicked Napoleon into touchdown and got him out of kind of the political sphere on the European scene for good. And in fact, look at a major component in the Prussian army, especially 1815, that really contributed to Wellington's victory at Waterloo. Now, I will confess that I have historically been pretty guilty of enforcing that Anglo view of the Prussians always late. I mean, they were still late, but it was an impressive feat, I'll give them that, to march and reorganize that quickly. But the more I look into the development specifically of the Prussian army and the limitations and stuff throughout the era, the more interesting they actually become. So this project for me isn't necessarily a punishment. I mean, painting lots of miniatures is always a punishment, but it's not a project that I'm going to undertake without, a kind of motivation from like kind of historical context. It's not like it's a dull kind of army, and actually, I'm quite looking forward to doing this and getting them on the tabletop. I mean, probably won't be until 2030 that they're finished, but that's another story. So, before I go into the kind of overview, I just want to apologize in advance for any butcherings of names, pronunciations. It's been a long time since I studied German, good 15, 16 years ago now, so my kind of pronunciation in that regards is very rusty, so apologies once again for that. And also, this is going to be an overview rather than an in-depth detail, so there's obviously going to be things that I've overlooked or kind of simplified just to kind of build a narrative going forwards. At the outbreak of the Napoleonic Wars, the Prussian state was essentially a sleeping giant. They had huge successes in the century before, under Frederick the Great, where he'd reformed the Prussian army into probably the most modern and well-oiled machine, especially during the Silesian and Seven Years' War, that you kind of saw at the time, and it kind of set the benchmark for European army organisation during that century. Uh, he'd also turned it in this kind of backwater German state into being the third largest army in Europe. And more importantly, the army itself was an integral part of Prussian society. Now, there's always been a long kind of military kind of focus in terms of Prussia. It kind of evolved out of the Teutonic Knights land holdings, becoming a state within itself. And it was remarked by the minister Frederick von Schroeter that Prussia was not a country with an army, but an army with a country, which I think is a significant difference. Like, the Prussian state existed for the army, as opposed to the army being there to defend the state. And however, after the death of Frederick the Great, there was a lot of kind of resting on its laurels, and conditions relaxed around like kind of the military doctrine, and there was little interest in war, uh, specifically on the part of Frederick William II. And the responsibility of the army was delegated to Charles William Ferdinand, the Duke of Brunswick, who was quite an old guard figure within that kind of Prussian elite society. He'd served under Frederick the Great, and he was kind of responsible for the degrading in quality of the Prussian forces, mainly because he was blinkered by the successes, and they retained the tactics and equipment that had been so successful 40 years earlier. And it found itself very poorly equipped to deal with revolutionary France and the rise of Napoleon, which resulted in Prussia withdrawing from the First Coalition and having to cede its Rhenish territories in the 1795 Peace of Basel. Now, whilst other nations were busy forming subsequent coalitions, Prussia adhered to the Treaty of Basel until Frederick William III entered Prussia into the Fourth Coalition. Now, this grand re-emergence of Prussian military might was kind of not to be, because of the decisive defeats at Saarfeld and the twin battles of Jena-Auerstadt led to Napoleon's swift occupation of Berlin, which was a hugely humiliating thing for the Prussian state. Now, why was it so swift? Well, the Prussians had been famed for discipline for the past century and their military stability. It completely collapsed, although a few commanders managed to kind of save their reputation a little bit, like Blücher and Gneisenau, who had become significant contributors later on in kind of that restitution of Prussian military might. Now, these humiliating defeats and the occupation of Berlin led to the Treaty of Tilsit, which basically halved Prussian territory and significantly imposed a limitation of 42,000 men being allowed to serve in the army, which was a humiliating prospect for the forces of Prussia, who had at its height been at least 200,000 strong under Frederick the Great just half a century earlier. But the most significant impact, I think, of these defeats was the fact that it had completely shattered the Prussian establishment and their perception of Frederican invincibility. However, what is also notable is that the wider population, despite being a military-focused state, were very indifferent to these defeats. The failures of the 1806 campaign led to the complete overhaul of Prussian society, including the abolition of serfdom and the reform of state administration and the army. Of the 143 Prussian generals in 1806, only Blücher and Tauentzian remained employed and in service by the time of the Sixth Coalition. The officer corps, which had been guarded by the elite and nobles of society, was reopened to the middle classes in 1808, and advancement was based now upon education as well as birth. 1809 and 1810 saw the creation of a war ministry, an officers' training school in Berlin, which would become the Prussian War Academy, which played such an integral part in Prussian dominance and the unification of the German state later on in the 19th century. Von Scharnhorst was an advocate of adopting the French levy en masse. However, due to the limitations on Prussian military numbers imposed by Tilsit, he created the Krumpe system, which effectively entered a grey area in the conditions of the treaty in order to build up a considerable, well-trained reserve that could be raised quickly to supplement the official 42,000 strong army. Now, some estimates consider this figure to be around an additional 150,000 men that would be trained and ready to come to arms in future conflicts. Now, we see this later on in the rapid raising of the Landwehr, and I think this system is what makes it so interesting. Not only did they completely change how they fought tactically, they were able to kind of get round the very small standing army for a major power with mass kind of, not necessarily conscription, but trained or partially trained men that were ready to fight if the time needed, by like kind of rotating in numbers. Now, the basic principle of the Krumpe system was a rotation of 3 to 5 men per company each month, meaning that an extra 60 men could be trained per company each year, again building up to those numbers on a huge scale, thinking of how many companies there are in the regiments of even just those 42,000 strong army. The Krumpe system also established a shorter 3-year compulsory service, replacing the 5 to 10 conscription that was previously in place. Now, one of the more petty limitations imposed by the French was that the Prussian army could not form divisions. Now, this is quite interesting and confusing on a gaming perspective as well, because it essentially meant that the Prussian army consisted of 6 very bloated brigades, which consisted of 6 to 8 infantry battalions, 12 squadrons of cavalry, which were supported by artillery. Now, this is basically a division in all but name. But we look at, say, a French division that's made up of 4 brigades consisting of 6 battalions in each brigade. You're pretty much on the same kind of size as a Prussian brigade, as a French division. The British division, again, 3 brigades of 4 battalions. Kind of, it just seems very petty. Now, another notable reform, again, mainly championed by Scharnhorst, was the combined arms approach, promoting integration of infantry, cavalry, and artillery, as well as engineers to a lesser extent. The equipment and the tactics were updated to reflect the changes and demands of the Napoleonic warfare. And York's 1812 field manual placed an emphasis on combined arms and faster marching speeds. Although this is quite interesting because obviously that reflects the evolving nature of warfare at the time. But York himself was more of a traditionalist and went out of his way to oppose some of the reforms, especially those centred around aristocratic privilege in the officer class. At the time of the 1809 campaign, there was huge pressure from reformists, those that had been rebuilding and retraining the army, to make Frederick William throw off the conditions, quite often the humiliating conditions of the Treaty of Tilsit, and join Austria in their campaign against France. However, the king, probably wisely, given how everything unfolded since, resisted that pressure and remained, to an extent, neutral, although offering France support. Now, we kind of get a good insight into Napoleon's kind of thoughts and opinions of the Prussian state, specifically in 1810, when, on the death of Queen Louisa, that he referred to her as the king has lost his most able minister. And he'd also gave her a kind of backhanded compliment after the Treaty of Tilsit, which she famously kind of attempted to advocate for better terms on behalf of Prussia, as saying that she was the only real man in Prussia. So I don't think Napoleon had a very strong opinion of the Prussian state and soldiers. Now, there is a contrast here with the Austrian state, where their army was quite mocked after the 1809 campaign, and Napoleon responds in a manner saying, were you there at Aspern, Esslin or Wagram? And they're some of the finest soldiers in Europe, but led by idiots, essentially, or something along those lines. So you can see the contrast here, that he wasn't against recognising true determination and the ability of his opponent, but the fact that his few remarks about Queen Louisa, especially in a society that was so male dominated, kind of didn't mask his opinions, or low opinions, of the Prussian state at the time. The Treaty of Paris in 1812 forced 20,000 troops, so half of Prussia's standing army under the terms of Tilsit, were to join the Grand Armée and its invasion of Russia. And it also reaffirmed the French occupation of Prussia itself, having garrisons, uh, stores, depots, that kind of thing, and being part of the supply chain for the war. Now, I won't cover the ongoing events such as Borodino and the campaign itself, because that's more of a French thing. But significantly, during the retreat from Moscow after the winter, York, who was in command of the Prussian army at that point, went out of his way and independently signed the Convention of Torringen with Russia, which broke the Franco-Prussian alliance. Now, this was off his own back, so he could basically have been declared a traitor because he'd gone against the state and kind of gone rogue. But the act forced the king's hand and put Prussia at a huge risk of the fresh French armies being formed on the Rhine. Now, retrospectively, it was York's kind of rogue initiative that basically kick-started the Prussian regeneration and paved the way for the later dominance of mainland Europe. Because without him turning against France and joining the Russians, I don't think the campaigns that subsequently unfolded would have happened. Prussia would have still been very constricted with the limitations on its army, and you wouldn't have been able to see how well the Krumper system had been a success in raising significant numbers. So it was as a result of these actions that Prussia was forced to kind of, or basically marched by York into the War of the Sixth Coalition, and the Landwehr were mobilised en masse to support the small standing army. Now, the most significant thing about this is that, in contrast to 1806, where the populace had been very, who cares about the war, the populace were very supportive of the war, and there were thousands of volunteers to join the army, as it kind of cultured and restored Prussian national pride. Now, we all know what happens eventually with Prussian national pride, and it's a bit of a taboo subject, but it could really be seen to kind of, this is the point where it's starting to be rekindled and then go on to much bigger and Now, during the 1813 campaign, the Prussian army played a significant part, which obviously culminated in the Battle of Leipzig and the collapse of the French state. In 1814, the continuation of that campaign and the occupation of France saw a universal reintroduction of conscription, with men successively serving in the army for 3 years, then moving to the reserves for 2, and then into the Landwehr, or the Landsturm, until the age of 39. militiamen would serve for a few weeks annually in the Landwehr for 7 years, which kind of created a civilian army approach, and it significantly contributed to a reversal of Prussia's fortunes, as well as further uniting, which I think was its main purpose, Prussian society once again. Now, at this time, Prussia's army had been restored to about 136,000 strong, and due to the reinforcements of the reforms and the Landwehr, could be supplemented by an additional 160 odd thousand. And despite the Landwehr being a militia, they were actually rather well trained and experienced due to their participation in the 1813 campaign and their kind of role in the Krumper system and the rotation. So where you think of, oh, we're going to raise the conscripts, you're just thinking of, even at this time, people armed with kind of pitchforks or whatever musket or thing they use for hunting, perhaps. But the Landwehr represented more of a stronger and kind of more ragged fighting force than your ordinary rabble of conscripts. When Napoleon returned from exile in 1815 from the tiny little island of Elba, Prussia was ready and quickly mobilized for war. Its army in the Lower Rhine under Blucher and Gneisenau played a huge part in the Hundred Days campaign, showing a dogged determination to send Napoleon packing once again. Now, when the Allies came together at the Congress of Vienna, it was very apparent that they wanted standing forces to kind of limit any potential revival. I think the main four nations, being Britain, Prussia, Russia, and Austria, had all committed to have a standing army of 150,000 ready to kind of counter Napoleon's return. The British offset their numbers because of their commitments in America and restraints with offering funding for the other armies. Now, it's interesting when you look at the map because you've got like the positioning. So you have Wellington, well, you have like the British Anglo Dutch army based around Antwerp in that kind of area. Blucher with his army of the Rhine, and then you see lots of little armies kind of pretty much surrounding France. So when Napoleon returns, it's not like, oh, I can go and kind of take Italy by the back door because that's blocked by an Austrian army. He can't go through the middle because you've got a Prussian army there. And then go to the north, you've got the British army. Now, when approaching the 100-day campaign, I think Napoleon has looked at it, he's assessed who his biggest threat is, and he sees that threat as unification of these forces. Now, he wants to attack and take Brussels, which will then completely put Britain and its supplies out of the campaign and prevents them from linking with any of the other armies. If he can take out a Prussian army at the same time, it gives him a good chance of being able to build a decent footing to kind of cement his position and get terms from the remaining nations. However, that is what he attempted, but it didn't go to plan. It started off well. He convincingly defeated the Prussians at Ligny, and Napoleon believed them to be broken and out of the war. And that Prussian determination really comes to to the fore, because Blücher was seriously injured under his horse. I mean, he was in his 70s at this point, and there was a point in the battle where they feared him dead, and Gneisenau ordered the retreat to the fullback. There was a lot of discussion where they would fall back to, whether it would be a rout and a rabble, but he managed to maintain an orderly retreat back to Wavre, which in, which was going back towards kind of Wellington's position rather than to his supply line. So they took that risk, but it seems pretty confident that he was um, able to keep the army on the whole together and keep it organised, as opposed to just waves of soldiers kind of running, marching to wherever they wanted to kind of just get to safety. Now, Napoleon at this point had written them off, and his attention would turn to Wellington, and after Wellington's victory at Quatre-Bras, he would face him at Waterloo. So, how did Napoleon shepherd the Prussians? Well, he left Napoleonic Wargaming's Tim's very own favourite marshal, Grouchy, to pursue them with a single corps to Wavre, thinking that he could just push them back and completely wipe them from the kind of the campaign. However, just how far the Prussian army had reformed and had learned their lessons from the wars of the Napoleonic era can be seen and summarised in how quickly they were able to rally, reorganise, and redeploy in such a rapid and efficient manner on such a huge scale. I think it was 3 entire corps to be able to assist Wellington in routing the French at Waterloo. Now, this is where it gets contentious from a British Anglo perspective. It's often belittles, should we say, the Prussian contribution to this. Now, in my own mind, I don't think that Napoleon would have beaten the British had the Prussians not arrived. I think it would have been more of a stalemate, but it would have served the same purpose because the French needed that breakthrough victory. But I think Blücher and the Prussians' arrival enabled a convincing defeat which would have convinced the French population at large that Napoleon was done for, as opposed to kind of a bit rattled, and it would have been easier for them as a result to kind of change the regime again. Now, whilst the Anglo-Allied forces stood firm throughout the day, it was the Prussians' surprise arrival late in the day which, as I said, tipped the scales decisively against the French. The action specifically around Plassenois, and that forced Napoleon to overstretch his resources and hastened his defeat. Now, when the Prussians first started to emerge, it was due to their kind of dark uniforms. There was a lot of confusion whether it was actually Grouchy arriving, and Napoleon kind of, whether it was Napoleon himself or some of the marshals. They kind of wanted to reinforce that, oh yeah, Grouchy's here, we're going to win, let's push on. So when they realised that it was the Prussians, that kind of had a huge impact on morale just from them being there, let alone attacking them. And that really kind of led to total defeat for the French, because the morale that they normally had was shattered by that illusion of Grouchy coming, and the Landwehr, having gone toe to toe for several hours in the streets and church of Plassenoir, um, really kind of showed that the time was up for Napoleon. Now, this victory gave not only the British their kind of dominance in kind of military superiority and the kind of golden age of the British Empire, it also had a very similar effect on the mainland of Europe, as it once again laid the foundations of Prussian dominance in Europe, and the Prussian fortunes for the rest of the 19th century continued to grow and culminated in the foundation of the German Empire under Prussia. So, how does the black powder rules go as to representing the Prussian army? Now we're going to focus on the 1815 campaign and the rules in Albion Triumphant 2. Again, a subtle nod to the Anglo-centric view of specifically Warlords gaming. Now, just looking at the rules, in Black Powder, infantry is very kind of generic. There's not much difference really between them, but there are kind of some special rules that give flavour to the nations. Now, the Prussians in their kind of formation obviously have to take an infantry brigade, and I actually think, looking at this is probably one of the few army lists where I feel like you can actually get the correct kind of flavour for the force of the time. So in the Prussian infantry brigade, you have to have 2 to 3 infantry regiments formed from either line regiments and Landwehr, but you have to have at least one of each. Now, the line regiments, you have the Fusilier Battalion and then 2 Musketeer battalions, which again represents the correct kind of constitution of a Prussian regiment, as well as Landwehr infantry of up to 2 to 3 battalions. You can add tiny Jaeger companies, foot artillery, Landwehr cavalry in small units. Now, that gives you, in one brigade, that kind of pinnacle of combined arms approach. You've got huge amounts of infantry, you've got your artillery, and you've got cavalry element. Obviously, you can upgrade and stuff to suit. Command ratings, obviously, again, points value. And I think that just summarises the army. Now, obviously, that's a lot of units in one place. I mean, you could have up to 12, 13 units commanded by one brigade commander. Now, this is probably one of my favourite rules for the Prussians, is that obviously we know that command roles are critical in Black Powder, and if you fail the role, that's it. You don't get to move anything else in that brigade, you've got to move on to the next one. Whereas to kind of represent the sheer size of the Prussian brigade being actually kind of more of a division in size. You have something called the staff system, which allows you to purchase a brigade sub-commander, and therefore you can give orders through the sub-commander um, instead, and then when he fails, you can revert to the brigade commander. So it basically gives you a failsafe kind of reroll, so to speak. Now, you also have the Angriffskolonne and Zug column, which are assault column and column of companies. So, again, just some very fancy names for um, formations, and they gain tough fighters when playing French because obviously they are very, very angry that the French occupied Berlin, ate all their sausages, and then didn't give them some good beer and wine in return. Which I think having rerolls in of any sort in Black Powder when it comes to combat is massive because you have such a limited amount of dice where that one reroll can change the entire swing of that combat. And the amount of times that I've done it with the Russians, um, where it's just giving you that extra point to win combat, and then the break test has obliterated the unit or made them fall back, has had a huge impact in that area of the game. Now, the part where I'm looking at the cavalry, this is where I get, especially from a points-based game system, I find it a bit harder to replicate the Orbats, should we say, on the tabletop. Now, obviously, if you're playing an Orbat, you have no restrictions. You just play with what the units are. And I quite happily play that most of the time. But I wanted to specifically look at how the army list reflects an Orbat as opposed to just playing an Orbat, just to get a feeling for that. Now, the cavalry have limitations. You can only take a cavalry brigade per 2 infantry brigades. So if you're following an Orbat, the only way you can represent it is to take an entire corps. So each cavalry brigade can have 2 to 4 cavalry regiments, being Uhlans, Dragoons, Hussars. Now, you can't have 4 of each. I think it's 2 Uhlan, 2 Dragoons, or 3, and up to 3 Hussars. Or you've got the Landwehr Cavalry Brigade, which is 2 to 5 regiments of Landwehr Cavalry, which again shows that the army itself was very reliant on the presence of Landwehr units. Now, I think you're pretty much 1-to-1, not quite, but can be 1-to-1 in some, or for line to Landwehr. You can even have more Landwehr than line regiments. So you could have 3 battalions of line, 6 battalions of Landwehr in an infantry brigade. You can have 5, well, let's say we're going to take 2 Prussian infantry brigades. You can have 6 line, 12 Landwehr, 12 units of some size of Landwehr cavalry. No, sorry, not 12. 7 units of Landwehr cavalry, 3 to 4 units of other cavalry units. It's a very significant part. And in the rules, the only real difference between line and Landwehr is the unreliable rule, which quite a lot of nations, like if you look at Spain, Neapolitan. They have unreliable, uh, which, although is a consistent part of the rules and it can have a big impact on games, the fact that their mob, should we say, is in every other regards exactly the same as their line infantry really attests to the performance that the Landwehr had in the campaigns of the late Napoleonic Wars. And I think it, gives you a good variety as well as painting. So it's like there's no reason not to take them. So you can have a line regiment, you can have a reserve regiment, which is basically a line regiment but different colours, and you can have your Landwehr regiment. That's three different uniform types. That's three different colour schemes potentially, because at this point the Prussian infantry in themselves weren't fully transitioned into their dark blue uniforms. There was some in black, some in green, some in white, some in brown, because they hadn't had time to dye and prepare that many uniforms. So it's a good painting opportunity as well, and I think when it comes to the brigade that I'm going to paint, I think that's the route that I'm going to go. A line regiment, I'll paint a reserve regiment, and I'll paint a Landwehr regiment just to have variety to keep me engaged in that painting process. And I think just as a kind of final overview of the Prussian army, um, it's one of those that I think you can just put a brigade on the tabletop and it looks like an army. So if you were wanting to collect a small project, you could literally just do a Prussian brigade straight out of the um, army list and have something that looked like an army rather than having to have multiple brigades. Whether it functions well enough on the table is debatable, but if you look at this, your opponent's got to destroy 5 battalions before that is broken brigade, as opposed to 1 or 2 of other armies. Yes, it would lose some of its flexibility in that kind of deployment, but I don't necessarily think that is a bad thing to happen. Now, as for my overall kind of plans, I've not really picked out much. I think I want to do probably 2 infantry brigades and some cavalry brigades, but I'm not sure yet whether I want to do it in epic or in 28mm. I've got a start of both, so over time I probably will do it in both. But in terms of this challenge, I'm not 100% sure yet. Another thing that I just want to briefly mention at the end is the scenario itself in the Albion triumphant that revolves around Plassenois. Now, this is a bit of a spoiler into my trip from Waterloo, but me and Tim, as we were wandering around, we were looking at Plassenois and we were looking at like the lay of the streets and the church and everything, and I was like, I'm sure there's a scenario in Albion triumphant that is Plassenois focused, and being such a pivotal kind of battle, well, within a battle at Waterloo, I then went and looked in my battered copy of Albion Triumphant that evening, because yes, I was a bit of a geek and took it with me, and worked out exactly what I needed to make it happen. And I'm actually quite excited to play scenario, and I'm not normally like that with the Warlord suggested scenarios, but I think that the Plasinoir one especially will be quite interesting to see how um, it will play on the tabletop. So hopefully we can work towards that at some point. I think that's more of my kind of idea. I might change some of the units, like I might swap some Landwehr with reserves just to mix things up a little bit, but use them as Landwehr rules wise. It's mainly just to keep me engaged on a painting front. So, I hope that I've not bored you too much. Uh, Hopefully, you've had a bit of productive hobby enjoyment whilst you've listened to me droning on. Um, but I just thought this would be quite a good video to kickstart that kind of Prussian series. Next week, or maybe slightly later, will be my thoughts on the trip that me and Tim had to Waterloo. I've decided that I'm just going to have more of like a talk through, a bit like this, and leave a lot of the filming to Tim because it was quite windy, and then having to stop, start to film for one person was fine, but having, if I then basically did it, it would have been very repetitive, and yeah, so I thought I'd just have more of a kind of like reflective video on that with a lot of the pictures that I took from it. Now, there may or may not be cabbages involved, and wheat fields because Tim decided to be navigator for the first day. That things quickly changed, but I won't go into that now because this video has gone on a lot longer than I actually thought. So I hope you've enjoyed it, and I will see you all in the next one. Thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe. Until next time, enjoy your hobby.